Hello, everyone. My name is Charles Fisher. I'm a lieutenant at the Torrance Police Department in Southern California, specifically Los Angeles County. The title of my thesis is Spread Too Thin, the Impact of Homelessness on U.S. Law Enforcement. In all honesty, I stumbled on this topic as a result of my personal experiences. I was a sergeant in charge of a homeless outreach team for several years. Uh, in that position, I really became familiar with the obstacles and the trials that these officers go through in their interaction with homelessness, and really the frustrations involved from both those suffering from homelessness and the officers that are engaged in those communities. Just prior to attending NPS and just prior to starting my research, I was assigned to our Special Investigations Division, where I was asked to manage and command 4 very proactive investigative units and traditional policing. We had a gang detail, we had a narcotics unit, we had a joint terrorism task force element, an intelligence unit. Obviously on the other side of the spectrum in terms of law enforcement details, from the homeless outreach team to our Special Investigations Division. And simultaneously at the time, like many organizations across the country, we were facing significant staffing issues. Recruitment retention was a concern, and we were all asked to reassess and prioritize where our personnel should be in the organization, what should be left vacant, that sort of thing. And it was during this time that I started to notice that we were pulling personnel from traditional policing positions, like your gang units, your narcotics unit, even traditional uniform policing. But we were really hesitant to understaff or even leave any vacancies in our homeless outreach or homeless specific units. And I started questioning if this was the proper move. I really began to have concerns about whether our efforts were misguided, whether we were reallocating our most precious resources, our personnel, to details where they were likely going to be unsuccessful. And with that, I produced my research question, which you see here. Does the current state of homelessness in the United States place an unreasonable burden on law enforcement resources to the point that traditional policing and homeland security concerns are being adversely affected? In terms of completing my research, I decided to go with a nationwide survey online. It seemed the most feasible. This was unfortunately, at the peak of COVID, at the time of civil unrest. So a survey with law enforcement at the time wasn't ideal circumstances, but even with that, I had over 700 responses. All 50 states were represented, and it really produced some significant data that I'm quite proud of. The initial portion of the survey, I decided to do simple demographics. I asked what the years on the job were, the tenure of the officer, so to speak, the location, narrowed down only to state. I wanted to keep it anonymous. The size of the agency, meaning the number of sworn officers in the organization, the population they serve, whether it's big city, rural, small area, those types of things. In reality, the bulk of my questions to this survey hit on these topics here. I really wanted to capture the perception of law enforcement officers in terms of if they believed during the length of their career the population of homeless individuals grew in their jurisdictions. I wanted to know about arrests, pretty much everything that would really cause an impact to organizations. Time spent was a huge one. I asked, what percentage do you think your officers spend of their day interacting or engaging with homeless specific issues, calls for service, arrests, that sort of thing. I also hit on service resistance. You'll see there on the top right. That was also significant. How many of these people that you're engaging, you're trying to offer help to, for example, do not want anything to do with you? Mental illness, drug, alcohol addiction. Similar questions. What's your perception of your homeless communities? What percentage of them do you believe suffer from mental illness, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, or a combination thereof? And I also asked about partnerships with nonprofits, organizations outside of law enforcement in order to engage this problem. Another question I really was curious about is whether they had homeless specific units or officers assigned specific homeless related tasks. And then I also asked follow up whether they thought that was effective, whether they thought it was making an impact and actually lessening homelessness in their community. Okay, so what was learned? Some things were very much expected. For example, homelessness across the country on the rise. That was a very common theme, the perception of homelessness in the communities, the perception of time spent on homelessness, all seems to be increasing over the length of these respondents' careers. What wasn't as expected, at least in my perception, was the fact that mental illness, addiction, resistance to accept services from those suffering from homelessness are hurdles that officers really see as somewhat insurmountable in their day-to-day tasks, specifically with the resources available to them. This is just a nationwide example, but the officers were asked to state the percentage of your jurisdiction's homeless population that they perceive is reluctant to accept services and or resources when offered. Now, remarkably, the most common answer nationwide here was 80 to 90%. So not only have we determined that many jurisdictions are spending a significant portion of their day, some jurisdictions most of their day, engaging these problems and offering resources and responding to these calls for service, when 80 to 90% of the homeless population, at least is perceived, doesn't want your help. Now, obviously that segues into recruitment, retention. Are we setting our officers up for failure? Clearly, they don't perceive to have the resources available or the ability to solve these types of problems in a 20-minute call for service. There's also a huge disparity. This was a real learning point, a huge disparity in perception of time spent engaging homelessness, dealing with homeless specific calls for service, homeless specific tasks as a law enforcement officer. Large indication of a communication issue between senior law enforcement and the officers doing these tasks on the ground, so to speak. Okay, here you can see the visual representation of that discrepancy I discussed between senior officers and line level officers. This is gathering the data and separating it based on tenure or years in service. You'll see the top graph represents participants with 1 to 10 years on, the bottom graph 16 years or over. And the question was, from your observation, state the percentage of your field personnel's time that is spent on calls for service or other activities involving homeless individuals specifically. I mean, look at these two graphs. They're completely contradictory. You'll see senior officers typically are ones running law enforcement organizations, your policymakers, that sort of thing, the ones that allocate personnel and resources. Predominantly 10% is their perception of the time officers spent in the field engaging homeless individuals in one way or another. Now you ask the officers likely actually doing these day-to-day tasks. Most common answer, 80%, and the bulk of it, 70, 80, 90% of their day engage with these tasks that they have little resources to actually be successful in, and ultimately, in my opinion, are set up for failure. And then obviously that has a nexus to recruitment, retention issues, you name it. It's very revealing. And lastly, the fact that traditional policing positions are being left vacant, they're being abandoned in order to staff these homeless specific units, with which the data indicates simply aren't working. They're simply not making a dent in this problem, and they're not lessening homelessness at all, at least in the perception of these officers. So here you see an example of a chart from my thesis, just to give you an idea of the traditional policing positions that are being left vacant in organizations that actually deploy a homeless specific unit. These are all traditional policing positions that are legitimately being abandoned in order to staff homeless specific units. Now, why is that important? What do we learn from that? That's fine if homelessness is your priority, which in a lot of communities, including mine, it is. If you ask the citizens what is a priority for them in terms of quality of life, they really would like to see an impact on our homeless community, uh, finding people homes, getting them off the street, taking them out of those environments. Problem is, I also asked in my survey, do you consider these homeless specific units effective? And you'll see that overwhelmingly, um, they're considered ineffective. In short, I've learned that homelessness is taking priority in police organizations across the country. Minimal resources, obstacles such as mental illness, addiction, the reluctance to accept services has our police personnel feeling like they've been set up for failure, like they simply don't have the resources to be successful, and they're spending majority of their day sometimes engaging these problems with little chance of success. To make matters worse, homelessness is likely having a much greater impact than our organizational leaders recognize. The communication gaps between line level personnel and our senior law enforcement personnel is extreme. So with that, as budgets are reduced and law enforcement resources grow scarce, and we're facing cries for reform, cries for defunding even, we must revisit the role of law enforcement. And I think we need to be hesitant when we take on roles that veer too far from traditional policing. Decision makers today, I think, need to acknowledge that other entities outside of law enforcement and in cooperation with law enforcement may be better suited to lessen homelessness in our communities. It's time to revisit law enforcement's role in this field.